So hello, my name is Lan Qie, known as Lainey. I'm a senior lecturer in ecology and conservation from University of Lincoln. So I realize I'm probably the only ecologist in this crowd, but I must say I'm an ecologist with an engineering background. So that really makes me qualify, I guess, to really connect with many of you here who are engineers. And I am an engineer at heart, I would claim. So as I really enjoyed the previous career talks. I have quite a lot to share from my own career journeys, perhaps after the talk. But today I'm going to focus on the carbon dynamics in ecosystems, as you can see in the title. I think earlier we heard a really interesting long view from Dr. Fred Patterson to bring us back to the recent human history, where tremendous change has happened between our relationship, between the human society and nature. So hopefully in my talk, I will bring something useful to you in terms of stepping out of the built world and looking at the carbon in ecosystems. And let me remind you here, carbon is fundamental to life. Carbon is absolutely the backbone for life form on Earth. So perhaps I would make this brave claim here. The best place where carbon should belong is in ecosystems. So I think it's perhaps useful for me to start with a broad picture to look at just where the global carbon is distributed in different pools. So I will draw your attention first to the biotic pool in green on top left. So that's where the plants, the animals, the ecosystems are cycling carbon. So where does it cycle carbon from? From the atmosphere through photosynthesis. So the biggest important arrow there is the arrow from the atmosphere to the biotic pool through photosynthesis. So plants are the primary producers in the Earth's ecosystem that transforms carbon in the atmosphere to the ecosystem. And then you can see that from the biotic pool, there is another important route for carbon to be injected into the soil carbon pool. And then, of course, on top of that, we have the atmospheric pool, the oceanic pool, the fossil fuels. I actually don't like the way this chart is organized, where the fossil fuels are a standalone bubble. In fact, it is not. What are fossil fuels? Fossil fuels are from the ancient plants and animals, so they really should be part of the biotic pool. Isn't that right? So I guess the take-home message here really is that it is the ecosystem that's driving the fundamental carbon cycling on planet Earth. Now, I want you to, again, look at ecosystem carbon, but now from a different biome perspective. Where are the carbon distributed in terms of different terrestrial ecosystems, biomes? So these regions are color-coded for tropical forests, tropical savanna, deserts, temperate forests, etc., to tundra and boreal forest. And I guess not surprisingly, we realize most of the carbon is distributed in the tropical and subtropical ecosystems. So forests, especially lush forests, the rainforests, they account for the biggest chunk of carbon on Earth. But not to ignore, in fact, temperate forests, boreal forests, even tundra account for actually a substantial chunk of the terrestrial carbon as well. And now, perhaps looking at the dynamics. So this isn't a very new figure, in fact. This is data from 2012 published in Nature, as you can see. But I really like this figure because it can highlight a very important gap between the emission increase and the atmospheric CO2 increase. So if you look at the red line in the middle, so that's the alarming line of fossil fuel emissions increasing over the years. And by 2010, the rate of carbon dioxide added to the atmosphere is at over 8, roughly 9, whereas the atmospheric CO2 increase, the blue curve in that year, is only about half of that amount. What does that mean? Where has the other half of the carbon emission gone? It's gone into the biosphere carbon sink. So that's the black curve. So it's been uptake by the Earth's biosphere. So that really shows just how crucial the biosphere carbon sink is in combating climate change. And not surprisingly, a large chunk of this carbon sink exists in the world's forests. So this is a big paper published in 2011 in Science. At the time, this was rather controversial. So this shows just how persistent and large the world's forests are acting as carbon sink. And that's a really consistent trend across different biomes, different continents. And if you just look at the downward arrows, downward bars, those are the carbon uptake by forests from the atmosphere. So they are the good bars. And not surprisingly, the largest carbon sinks are in tropical regions. However, I was saying this is controversial. Why? Because as ecologists, we have long been seeing these mature forests. So a lot of these data come from mature, intact, primary forests across the world. And they represent what we call the climax ecosystems, meaning they have matured to an equilibrium where the biomass should really be at a constant, where the growth and the death of plant and animals are roughly balancing each other, and the biomass as a whole in those ecosystems we would have expected to be not changing over time. And yet we're discovering otherwise. Those forests are literally growing bigger, acting as carbon sink. So this, I guess, serves as a bit of the backdrop of my work from roughly 2012 to 2015, when I was doing my postdoc at University of Leeds. So the problem with this study is that in many of these regions, it was data efficient to back up this global picture, particularly in Southeast Asia. So we're talking about Borneo, that is Malaysia, Indonesia, and the surrounding regions. So in this estimate, Asia, in fact, has no data to provide enough statistics, and therefore they use the average from tropical Africa and tropical America. So this is where I came in. So just spend a quick moment to explain a little bit of my work during those years. So I always call myself a generalist ecologist, by the way. That's because my work has been fundamentally question-driven. I don't specialize in any particular plant or animal groups. And in fact, a large chunk of my career was dedicated to the underground accounting of the carbon stored in tropical forests in Borneo. So I was proper jungle woman for quite a few years, and I'm still the jungle woman at heart. I'm a field ecologist. So I spent easily 4 years doing the field work. But the background of this is that we want to measure the change in carbon stored in these forests. To measure change, we need long-term records. Therefore, we need places where there has been pre-existing measurements at tree level, per stem level. So those are the locations across Borneo, across 3 countries, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Borneo, where easily several generations of pioneer ecologists had put in their lifetime research, established permanent measurement plots in those forests. Many are very, very remote. So my job at the time is to consolidate all the existing data from various researchers, very, very international collaboration, collate all the data, find out where they are, and go in and remeasure all those places myself. So that took 4 years of my life. About 60,000 trees, about 100 hectares of forest. Every single mature tree has been permanently marked, identified to species if we could. Sometimes not possible because tropical diversity is just tremendous. There are thousands of tree species. And in 1 hectare, you could have over 200 species of just the mature trees. So it's a huge data set. And that gave rise to this one number, So how useful is my work? So that gave us one number, literally. So that green bar there shows the long-term estimate of above ground biomass change per hectare per year in Borneo's forest, or intact forest, I should emphasize that. And that is about 0.9 tons of dry mass per hectare per year increase, significantly different from zero. And that gave us the last piece of the missing puzzle in the global picture, because Asia was the only data deficient continent. And if you look at the 3 tropical blocks of the forest, of the world's tropical regions, Borneo served as the last independent kind of a natural experiment to show indeed those intact forests are accumulating biomass carbon over the recent decades. So we're talking about going back to several decades, the earliest data going back to 1958. So that figure is also almost surprisingly comparable to Amazon and tropical Africa. So further kind of reinforce the message that global tropical forests are acting in the same manner out of equilibrium. They are still growing. And in fact, one of the strongest hypotheses behind why this is so is that it is CO2 itself acting as a fertilizer for plant growth. So there is a natural feedback of our ecosystem. Whilst increased CO2 level in atmosphere is in fact stimulating growth, therefore lifting that, if you like, the maxima or the ceiling of those tropical forests, how big they can grow, and they are again out of equilibrium and trying to reach a new biomass maximum state. However, the story doesn't go across that simple. In fact, the long-term trend seems to suggest we are actually quite close to reaching a new equilibrium. So this kind of sink, however important it is perhaps slowing down. So that's, I guess, the not so positive side of that story. Okay, so as I mentioned, that's field work. So what is it like to do that kind of field work? It is like this. So running around in the most remote part of those tropical forests, but I saw that as a tremendous privilege, because I have really seen some of the most beautiful, pristine forests in Borneo, and perhaps many of those won't be there for much longer due to deforestation and many other factors. And the actual work is painstaking. For every tree, we want to capture the most accurate diameter measurements. And many times we need to have a big long ladder, sometimes just made from a tree branch, to measure the diameter above those gigantic buttresses. So Borneo's forest is quite unique compared to the Amazon and tropical Africa, because we have the tallest tropical forest in Borneo. So I'm quite proud to say this, even though I'm not from Southeast Asia. I see Southeast Asia almost like my second home. So our forest is tallest, therefore most carbon dense. So after tens and thousands of this kind of work, we arrive at that value. But as an engineer, let's go down to how we calculate first, before I move down to the next bit of the statement. So how we actually calculate it after we measure diameter is with a simple equation. There are so many engineers in this audience, so you will be like, well, it's a very straightforward question, isn't it? So we want to know the carbon stored in the tree, and therefore we want to know the volume. Indeed, that's how we try to calculate it. But the volume of life forms is such a difficult thing to estimate. So, like, the biological sphere is just not as easy to predict and to calculate compared to engineering. However, the equation roughly says how it is done. So it's using this allometric equation to link the dimensions we can directly measure, such as diameter and height, to the volume level estimate, biomass. Of course, the wood density would be part of the factor going into the equation. And height is often not possible to have data on. So sometimes these equations contains only diameter, as the predictor variable. And once you reach the dry biomass of a tree, about half of that is carbon. So that carbon content for dry matter is quite consistent. So the global average would be about 48, 49%, depending on species, but the variation, as I mentioned, is not very large. So it's actually quite acceptable to use an average carbon content for dry wood mass. So the allometric equation would scale with diameter, or the dry biomass will scale with diameter roughly with that kind of curves. And as you can see, even for a single species, such as this common Christmas tree species, Picea, it can vary. So the engineering side of myself has always been frustrated by how we do ecology in this particular aspect. It's very low tech. Let me just put it very bluntly. Although I hugely enjoy the nature of ecology, is very low tech. But this is the gold standard for estimating biomass in above ground, woody biomass. So moving a bit forward, can we use technology? Because I'm engineer trained, so I have always been very interested in exploring technology. And indeed, we do have high-tech tools now to facilitate carbon estimates. So particularly, you can use LiDAR scanning. It can be airborne or terrestrial. And now you have even satellite, spaceborne LiDAR scanning. And this is the very tallest tree in tropics found in Northeast Borneo, 94 meters. So yeah, I thought it's nice to show this. The height was estimated by LiDAR and confirmed on the ground. A tree climber I know was sent up to the top of the tree to measure it with a tape, confirm the height. So technology, how do we do it? Combining the ground sampling plot, as I said, is still the gold standard, with satellite remote sensing, with LiDAR scanning at different levels. So that's the package of tools we are going to use. Well, I think the world is moving already quite a way in that direction to implement such biomass estimates globally and for long-term monitoring as well. So this is obviously quite an expensive type of work. What do we do it for? Really, I think now I'm going to step just slightly away from my comfort zone, out of my discipline. I think a fundamental driver behind this is that our society, our economy has transformed in our thinking. In a sense, right the wrongs in the past. So the entire economic model has been wrong in not accounting for the cost of ecosystem when we are exploring it, exploiting it. So natural capital is increasingly being talked about, and carbon is one of those natural capitals that should be part of that economic equation. Therefore, carbon payment, carbon finance is now a major forcing driving both environmental research as well as the economy. So this is a recent paper, but I would say it's almost outdated because this world is accelerating. So this shows across the world's tropical forest, where are the major countries with investable carbon stored in those tropical forests, such as those we measured. So obviously, Indonesia, Malaysia, Brazil, those are the carbon-rich countries in these ways. And indeed, they should be paid for protecting those forests. And the researchers behind this study estimated the carbon price needed to pay for the protection of these forests. And it's around 40-something dollars per ton of CO2. And interestingly, if you look at the carbon market at the moment, the UK and EU ETS has a trend that's really shooting up, and we have actually already exceeded that kind of carbon price. Now, I'm not a financial expert, so I guess I should stop there before making a fool of myself. But I would just point out how important the carbon market is in conservation as well. So in the UK, we also have the voluntary carbon market. So one of such established example is the Woodland Carbon Code. So where woodland creations can be created to receive carbon payments, and these credits can be traded. And a few years ago, this map was pretty sparse. And now, as you can see, it's vastly increasing. So I'll just speed up a little bit by throwing a question. So does that mean we basically should just plant as many trees as possible? Coming from an ecologist, we always want to attach some caveats by certain movements. So planting trees is such a frequently talked about issue, and the government indeed has very ambitious pledge, and somehow we have to arrive at those goals. But the problem is, should we just plant them everywhere, anywhere? So this is where I think we'll just briefly look at the global picture again. In fact, if you look at the above ground versus below ground carbon storage across the biomes, much of the carbon globally is stored below ground, particularly in cool regions. So in temperate and moist regions like here, we have vast amount of carbon, in fact, below ground compared to the above ground vegetation. So let's not forget that by planting trees, while you are increasing above ground biomass, you may not necessarily increasing the below ground biomass. So this study, just to quickly summarize it, provided a really unique set of data to show exactly that. Planting trees after up to 39 years, if you add up all the carbon pools, many of these sites have not achieved net carbon gain when you pooled above and below ground. The reason behind this is most likely when you are planting in organic soils, there's a priming effect where tree litter input has accelerated decomposition in those stable carbon pools in the organic soil, therefore emitting CO2. So, so I'll skip this. I'll just touch on what's quite relevant here. In fact, we should draw closer to what's around us. I think Leicester is a particularly good place to talk about what we can do around us. Even in the urban habitats, there is surprisingly a high amount of carbon stored in urban ecosystems. So this study mapped the entire above ground biomass in the urban areas of Leicester. And the results far exceeded what's previously estimated using average values. So that's surprisingly good news. And inspired by this, I got a student to conduct a similar study to map carbon, above ground carbon in our campus at Lincoln. And I think the main take-home message here is we don't have a lot of carbon above ground because we're a new city. And where we have potential to increase carbon cover is to increase hedges. Hedges will be the most carbon dense woody vegetation where you can use small and marginal spaces to establish. So that's the really useful piece of information we shared with our sustainability team at the estates. I think I should just point you to the big picture and hopefully allow a little bit of time for some discussion. So the big picture really is, I want to point out to the nature-based solutions that comes hand in hand with technology-based solutions. And oftentimes we forget there is these two types of approaches and they need to be integrated. And many times nature-based solutions can be the cheapest and the most effective ways to combat climate change. And voluntary carbon market is definitely on the rise. And I think many of you would be much more qualified to comment on that. I think it's good news for us all, but there will be caveats on how that market is regulated and plant the right tree in the right place. That summarizes what I really wanted to point out earlier. There are a lot of challenges: land use competition, opportunity costs, and just people's behavior and views. We are so fixated in the way we do things. So doing things differently, just like rewilding our back garden and let some more vegetation grow, that's very, very difficult to persuade people to change their behavior. But we are all fundamentally land managers of the bit of land we have control over. So yeah, we should start from ourselves. I will finish there. Thank you.